Well, that should encourage me not to speak too long. Actually, I have long been uncomfortable with speakers who wanted to show off their erudition by raising profound questions to which they then provide no answers. And so I'm slightly uncomfortable that I'm in that role today, because we're going to let the panel do part of that. Answers may be the wrong word, but when we put this panel together in this conference, the idea of diplomacy and transition, it was with the thought that we wanted not only to talk about specific countries and the specific issues that have emerged, but to talk to people more generally about the problems, the limitations, and the opportunities of these kind of situations where societies are in flux. This is by no means a new thing. Professor Scott Harrop was reminding me over coffee that Jefferson lamented the outcome of various revolutions in his period, and certainly the world went through various cycles of revolution. More recently, one can think about 1848 or the end of the First World War or the end of the colonial period. So it is not a new subject, but it always seems to strike us as new because established orders and things are being shaken, and all of a sudden people's assumptions don't work. There is a huge desire among intellectuals to impose intellectual order on chaos. And there is an amazing capacity of people to thwart that. But often what happens, and I think we see it in the United States very strongly, is a demand that government do something, and that government somehow, particularly our government, manage to have some form of control and be able to enunciate a policy and then be seen to be following it and producing results. And of course, we are living in a 24-hour news cycle, and patience is not one of our virtues, and we tend to want answers very quickly at a time when societies are often going through transformations that will go on for years, if not decades. And I think the result of that intersection, or often clash, between unrealistic expectations and poorly enunciated policies is then a great deal of unhappiness and an assumption of failure. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have diplomatic failure. We can do that. But the point is to be realistic about what diplomatic responses can be. There is now, after a dozen years of steady warfare, a realization that diplomacy might be a useful instrument of policy in the world. And so this is perhaps a propitious moment to be talking about diplomacy again. But there is also a sense that diplomacy is somehow limited to public statements and to aid levels and to whether we cut people off or fund them. And there is a kind of mystification about all the work that goes on behind that public gaze, what one can do, what one can't do. So we thought that bringing this group together to talk about how one influences transitions, when one can influence transitions, when one can't, when one has moments that a policy can be developed or implemented to shape things. One of the huge differences between living through a political moment and taking a university course is you don't get to take it over if you flunk. Seeing a moment of opportunity and how difficult that can be to utilize, particularly because moments of opportunity are rarely clear until you see them in hindsight. My father, who was also a diplomat, had actually preceded me as ambassador to Afghanistan, used to remind me that by the time you had all the facts in order to be certain of your decision, it was usually too late for the decision to be useful. But the conundrum of that is that you have to make decisions when they are not certain, and sometimes you will get them wrong. There are requirements for diplomats to understand the forces that are going on in a period of transition. This requires knowledge of society, it requires knowledge of language, it requires time, and these are things which frankly we're not doing very well today. One of our biggest problems in Afghanistan and Iraq is the rapidity with which we turn people over, so that we don't actually learn much. We don't build learning organizations, we build organizations of short-term enthusiasm, which then proceed to the next enthusiasm without much understanding of what last year's group did. But to do that otherwise means that we have to invest money, time, people, language training, depth. These are all requirements if diplomats are going to understand things. There is a considerable need within American society to deal with understanding that foreigners may actually define their own interests. I know that's shocking, but and people see it differently. I mean, we have people who regularly go to Pakistan, for instance, and they say, don't you understand that it would be in the interests of Pakistan to have a stable Afghanistan, and therefore you ought to stop doing various things. Unfortunately, the Pakistani view is that that's a really nice statement, but it's completely irrelevant because they have no ability to have a stable Afghanistan. In fact, they think that we will leave it a mess. And so their challenge is, how do they design their policy to protect their interests in an unstable country, which they take as a prerequisite to what they're going to have to deal with. Now, we may or may not be able to change that worldview, but understanding that it exists would have at least prevented several years of quite useless conversation. So understanding foreigners is part of standard diplomacy, but it is also a part of dealing with the world in transition. The relationship between Washington and our embassies in the field is a critical piece of diplomacy in a period of transition, because while we still bear the time-honored and hallowed title of ambassador, plenipotentiary, and extraordinary, we actually haven't had one of those in a very long time. Plenipotentiary means you were actually sent forth to negotiate a treaty, and you had the authority to sign it, subject to ratification at home. There was a day when, as I remember, can't compete with my hosts here, but there was a period where I think Jefferson noted on a memorandum that we have not heard from our ambassador in Spain in a year, or our minister in Spain in a year. If we don't hear from him in another year, we should write him. That delightful independence has passed. And so how a diplomatic mission orchestrates its relationship with Washington and the degree of freedom it has to make decisions is also very much a part of how diplomacy deals with period of transition. And one might suggest that there are really three levels of diplomacy in this kind of period: contact, influence, and support. And they're all different, and they all require somewhat different, if overlapping, tools. While a lot of these challenges are new, there obviously are several big new challenges that have added to the mix. And as a parenthesis, I might note that people often are talking about the diplomacy of the 21st century and what we need in people and in training. And that's true. There's a great deal which is new. But I like to remind people, or at least to challenge them, think of one major responsibility of a 19th century diplomat for which we are not still responsible. I have not been able to come up with one. That is, our tools change, but the things we're responsible for doing, we are still responsible for doing. We're just responsible for doing a lot of other things. But that means that the modern world is an add-on and not a substitute for its past. But among the add-ons, you have the incredible influence of non-governmental organizations, which were largely absent from the past, many of which are single interest and single dimension organizations that have one goal, one good in mind, and are frightfully uninterested in how that might clash with any other particular good. And that's not only a function of transition, it's a function of why, for instance, the United States is not a signatory to the Landmine Convention, which was developed largely by NGOs with a single view, and that view led to our not coming in. There is also obviously the effect of modern communication. Modern communication, it's not neither good nor bad, it's both. So you have, I'm sure Margaret will talk about it, you certainly have that, see that in the Egyptian Revolution, but you can also also have amazing rapidity of disinformation. When Mark Twain quipped that a lie can get halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on, he didn't even begin to understand how fast things could move. And I had a fascinating example of this not too long ago when there were a series of riots and demonstrations that many of you will remember concerning this stupid video about the life of Muhammad. And in Pakistan, some bright spark in our embassy decided that it would be brilliant to siphon up all the things that were running around on Twitter and funnel this stuff back to Washington. But they didn't apply sort of the old school political reporting habit of validating what you're picking up. And so suddenly the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who's a very modern woman and follows tweets, and her deputy, Tom Nides, were absolutely levitating with the story that mobs were coming over the wall of our embassy in Pakistan and about to sack the embassy. And in fact, nothing was happening. This was purely a matter of Pakistani rumor mill generating stories which were being picked up and moved back into our diplomatic reporting without sufficient care and attention, and produced a certain amount of crisis. So we have the effects of modern communication, we have single interest NGOs, we have domestic politics, which of course in this country is particularly vibrant. We have any number of ethnic and lobbies as well as interest lobbies, which also affect diplomacy, and then we have a very messy world. So it seemed to us that there was plenty here to talk about, and one way to get at it was to have a very distinguished panel, which we do, and I think you have all the biographies in the program, but I will just briefly mention the next panel because we'll get right to it when they're up. You have Ambassador McNamara, who has served in something, and I always have to read it because I can never get it tripped lightly off my tongue, the Information Sharing Environment, but it was basically a part of Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, reported to the President, and he has previously served as ambassador to Colombia, had a strong role as counterterrorism for head of the Counterterrorism Division of the State Department. Ambassador Matlock, who served at a really fundamental, foundational time in the transformation of the Soviet Union, and multiple tours there before, has served as a senior official in the National Security Council, an advisor to the President, author of a book, actually two books, Reagan and Gorbachev, How the Cold War Ended, three, because there's one that I don't see here about how everything is awful. A very prolific speaker and writer, and great pleasure to have him here. We've got Margaret Scobie, who was ambassador to Syria, who was ambassador to Egypt, who has again lived through another series. So in a few moments we'll get the panel up, and we will try to frame particularly three periods of particular transformation in the world, sort of not obviously in 15 minutes, it's a little presumptuous to call them case studies, but using each as a lens to look at the reality of the situation. So that's what we're about today, and then we're very fortunate to have Lord Petty Ashdown with us at lunch to bring a completely different perspective, not only from abroad, but one which I know will be unique, even though I have no idea what he's going to say. but I know that we're not likely to get standard drivel. So I'm looking forward to his putting his tie back on and speaking to us after lunch. So that's what we're about. We've got a few minutes. If anybody is just bursting with some question at this point, we'll give you a minute for that, and then we'll get on to real substance. And by the way, thank you for all coming. Please, sir, I see one. Do we need a mic, or can people just yell? Go ahead and yell. We'll see how it works.
Yeah, my question is, how does diplomacy limited to public statements?
How is it, or how is it not?
How is it limited to public statements?
It is not at all limited to public statements. It is just that there is a perception among people that diplomacy is a matter of standing up and making public statements, cutting off aid, and occasionally going to cocktail parties. And there's a great deal. All of what I hope that we will be talking about is what diplomats actually do in this period of transition. Anybody else who has an introductory question? I'm going to suggest, therefore, that since my role is not to do substance, but to sort of shape the form of what we're about, I'm going to propose that we actually take our break for coffee early. We have, which gives us an extra 7 minutes, and that we accordingly come back and start the next panel at 10:40. So may I invite you all to take a break, and we will... No, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Whoa. No move. No. Come back at what? 10:20. 10:20. Okay. So do come back at 10:20, and we will get our first panel seated, and we'll get to work. Thank you. Thank you for coming back in. By the way, over the break, somebody asked me to clarify a statement I made when I was talking about the NGO influence on particularly the landmine treaty, which, as many of you know, the United States is not a signatory to. And it's one of my favorite examples simply because NGOs mobilized way ahead of the United States government and took the position that the treaty had to totally outlaw landmines. The United States government took the position that we were going to lose a few thousand additional soldiers if there was a North Korean attack across the DMZ, and we wanted to preserve one controlled minefield that is in no danger to civilians because there aren't any in that area. And that was completely ruled out. But the NGOs had gotten ahead of the government and had locked a number of other governments into that position. So the result was that's the way the treaty came out, and to this day the United States has not joined the landmine treaty. But it is not an issue of immorality on the part of the United States government, but of protection of its own soldiers. And that was the example that I was using. Now, let us get on to the business at hand. I'm not going to do any other introductions. If you want fuller biographies, they're in the program. And let me invite Ambassador McNamara to begin. Thank you.